Okay, so we are going to begin. So this is going to basically be looking at the second chapter of the Galactic Diplomacy book. And so in this chapter, what I do is basically look at what has been the official diplomacy. Last week, or last month I should say, we talked about citizen diplomacy, or we talked about different types of diplomacy, and I just explained what are the differences between official diplomacy and unofficial diplomacy, and how really the goal here is that we all learn the conceptual tools and establish the kind of communication links so that we can actually become citizen diplomats. But what I'm going to talk about for today is actually the official diplomacy, because there actually has been official diplomacy with extraterrestrials. And to understand it, why there was that official diplomacy, we really need to look at the events that happened at the end of the Second World War, when the atomic bomb was used to end the war against Japan. Soon after that, extraterrestrials, flying saucers were seen near nuclear weapons facilities. And one of these facilities was Roswell Army Airfield, which at the time in 1947 was the world's only strategic nuclear bomber base. And it wasn't by accident that a UFO actually crashed near it, because it was targeted. It was targeted. So, and there's been a long history of extraterrestrials being very interested in nuclear weapons. Why are they interested in nuclear weapons? Well, because nuclear weapons, basically, we know they're very destructive. But what they do is that they basically create this enormous electromagnetic pulse that disrupts the space-time continuum. And so for us, maybe that's not such a big deal, other than electronics kind of going down anywhere in the vicinity of one of these weapons going off. But for the visitors, or for extraterrestrials who navigate space and time, it's like the analogy is like being on a pond, and you have a boat on a pond, and you just throw a giant rock in that pond, and just these enormous waves will capsize your little boat, right? So similarly with space-time, when you have these nuclear weapons being used, it disrupts the space-time continuum. So I think that is one of the major reasons why they were very interested in us developing these weapons. Now, what happened around 1950-51 was that basically US scientists decided that it was possible to develop a hydrogen bomb, a thermonuclear weapon, which basically was up to 1,000 times more destructive than the fission bombs used to end the war in Japan. 1,000 times more destructive. So these were weapons that not only had the potential to create a lot of damage on Earth, but also got the interest of extraterrestrials. And actually the very first extraterrestrial contacts that we know of revolved around this use of nuclear weapons, the plan that the US had to develop thermonuclear weapons. And so what happened was that in 1952, early 1952, as the debate was taking shape and the US was actually moving forward under President Truman to go ahead with developing and using thermonuclear weapons, a lot of scientists were opposed, but nevertheless they decided to go ahead. There were messages that the extraterrestrials communicated to official government representatives. The most famous, and the one that we know most about, was George Van Tassel, who was a contactee based at Giant Rock. And he was the organizer of the Giant Rock conventions, and they were really big gatherings over there in Southern California, Joshua Tree in that area. And basically he received communications. He was also a contactee with the extraterrestrials. He was in contact with the Ashtar Command. And that was actually the very first time the term Ashtar Command was used. There have been a lot of copycats since, but he was the first one to use that term. And basically they gave him messages to relay to the US military authorities not to go ahead with nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons, that this was very dangerous. And so he actually passed on that communication. He wrote a letter on behalf of the Ashtar Command to the US Air Force at Wright-Patterson Airfield, where some of the leading scientists were based, basically saying that these weapons should not be developed. They were very dangerous and they could threaten life on the planet and were very disruptive to the extraterrestrials themselves. What happened next was that the extraterrestrials, just to show that they were serious, said that we will demonstrate to you our seriousness in this issue, and for over 3 weekends in July you actually had the Washington flyovers. So you actually had fleets of UFOs flying over Washington DC. So they flew over Congress, they flew over the Pentagon, they flew over the White House, and it was really big news. All the major papers were covering it, these fleets of UFOs up there occurring at night. There was kind of thousands of witness sightings, there was radar trackings, Air Force pilots were scrambled to intercept and they reported on what they saw. So there was so much evidence that this was going on. What happened was that the Air Force eventually had to address the issue by basically saying that, well, it was just weather inversions or temperature inversions. So they had to kind of blow it off as not something not real. But yet this was a really remarkable display of galactic diplomacy, because when you had the extraterrestrials communicating with a private citizen saying that we're going to demonstrate our seriousness on this issue, you shouldn't go ahead with developing these weapons. And then they did the flyover. Thousands of people saw it. There was multiple reports in newspapers. So this was well covered. Then you had other contactees having their experiences and the same message being received. George Adamski, in November of 1952, he also had encounters with the extraterrestrials, and they told him the same thing. That the US government shouldn't go ahead with developing nuclear weapons. But nevertheless, President Truman decided that he would develop nuclear weapons. He would actually detonate the very first nuclear weapon, and that was on November 1st, 1952. It was a test that basically started off this age of thermonuclear weapons. And it was actually just a few days before President Eisenhower was elected. So somehow Truman felt that it was important to go ahead, not to have Eisenhower make this decision. So now we have a new president, President Eisenhower, and he was actually briefed about extraterrestrials. Eisenhower knew all about the issues, what was going on, and he knew that they did not want the world to go ahead with the development of nuclear weapons. And so what happened was that in October of 1953, President Eisenhower developed his Atoms for Peace proposal. So he went before the United Nations and actually said that all the countries of the world would be better off if all nuclear knowledge was actually given or assigned to the United Nations and used only for peaceful purposes. So this was... I'm sorry?
That's an oxymoron.
Well, that was the idea back then, that they would be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union just went through a transition. Joseph Stalin had died earlier in 1953, and the new leaders wanted to show that they were tough, and they didn't want to agree to this trap, as they thought it, of the US getting them to agree to abandoning nuclear weapons development. So they said no, and so Eisenhower decided that this was something that was not going to happen, that nuclear weapons would become something that would be developed through civilian purposes, such as the International Atomic Energy Commission. So what happened then was that Eisenhower decided that he would go ahead and develop nuclear weapons, and so the very first test of an actual bomb, of a thermonuclear weapon, a bomb, was actually scheduled for March 1st of 1954. The earlier device in 1952 wasn't actually a bomb, it was more a device that was stationary, whereas the one that was being tested in 1954 was an actual bomb that was being dropped, and so it could be used as a weapon of war. And so what happened was that 10 days before that test, President Eisenhower secretly travelled to Edwards Air Force Base to have a secret meeting. And there have been a number of people who have come forward to talk about this secret meeting. And basically it involved extraterrestrials, those that were in alliance with the Ashtar Command, kind of more positive, human-looking set of extraterrestrials that wanted humanity to abandon this development and testing of nuclear weapons and to go down another path where they would actually work with the extraterrestrials who would give them information, spiritual knowledge, so that when humanity was ready for it, then they would then receive more advanced information for developing technologies, more powerful technologies. Now, many of Eisenhower's national security advisors thought that this was a bad idea because they felt that it meant that the US would have to give up its atomic weapons, would have to give up its development of the thermonuclear weapons, and if they did that, if we did that and the Russians go ahead and develop it, we'll be vulnerable to the Russians, to the Soviet Union, so we can't do it. And so they said no to this group of extraterrestrials who basically said, stop your development of these weapons of mass destruction and we'll give you spiritual information, spiritual knowledge, so then you can later on develop technologies that will help your world evolve. So Eisenhower and his advisors, Eisenhower was advised to say no, and that's what happened. He said no. Then a year later, Eisenhower travelled in February of 1955 to Holloman Air Force Base. And so at Holloman Air Force Base, which is in New Mexico, this time he had a meeting with another group of extraterrestrial ambassadors. So this other group of extraterrestrial ambassadors weren't as concerned or weren't as troubled by the US developing hydrogen bombs. They still felt that they could reach a deal with the US, and so they did reach an agreement, and these agreements basically led to the US being able to get technologies from the extraterrestrial visitors, or this particular group or faction of visitors. And in return, the extraterrestrial visitors got a few things. They got basing rights, so they were able to establish bases in remote areas. Nellis Air Force Base being in particular one of the places, which is a huge facility in Nevada. So they developed hidden bases there. They also were able to extract resources. For some reason, they have a great need for water. Water is a resource that the extraterrestrials need. We are predominantly water planets, so we have abundance of water. So, and this has been seen. Many people actually see extraterrestrial ships in remote locations over and just kind of sucking up huge volumes of water into their ships. So they use it for whatever reasons. So that's a resource that they want. And there's also the third and most troubling is the biological, that they wanted to conduct a number of experiments with human subjects that could help them in their genetic programs, because their basic story was that they were suffering some kind of genetic degeneration, and that they were hoping that humanity, being in some way related to them, so they claimed, had a purer form of genetics that would help the visitors. And here we're talking about the grey-looking extraterrestrials, the short greys and the taller greys, that humanity's genetics would help them reinvigorate or regenerate themselves so that they could actually that they could have a future. So that was the kind of agreement that was reached. Now, is this a treaty? Is this an agreement? Well, the way it works is that in official diplomacy, what often happens is that you have diplomats reaching agreements. They'll have a treaty being signed by the president or the representative, and then it's given to Congress to ratify. But that treaty can still be implemented even though it's awaiting ratification by Congress or by the Senate in particular. So there are many examples of this. So, for example, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks resulted in treaties, the START treaties, and some of these weren't ratified by Congress, but they were signed by the president and the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, and so they were implemented. So what's happened here in the case of the agreements reached under the Eisenhower administration and the extraterrestrials back in 1955 was that these were signed, but they weren't ratified by Congress. There is a process by which Congress can be notified about agreements, even though Congress by law has to ratify it. Still, the US executive branch can always say, well, we consulted with Congress. In other words, they told the ranking members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that there's this agreement we've signed with off-world visitors, it's classified, you can't tell anyone else, this is what it's all about, don't talk about it, you've got to deny it exists. But they informed them. So it's kind of like a quasi-constitutional thing. It's like they're bending the Constitution. But nevertheless, they are very particular about following a certain set of protocols. They'll follow executive orders and so forth. So there is a kind of legal foundation that they can use to say that all of this actually is just, or is something that holds up, even though the public hasn't been informed, even though Congress hasn't been officially involved in any of these agreements or ratification. So essentially what that means is that starting in the 40s right through to the 50s, there were a kind of a number of incidents, events that happened which culminated in the US officially reaching agreements with one set of visitors. What has happened subsequently is that with the United States, countries that are closely aligned with the United States, and there's kind of like two tiers, or a number of tiers. First there's the echelon countries, and those are countries, basically English-speaking countries, where they share intelligence worldwide. It's a global intelligence network. It's the US, Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. Basically, they have a global intelligence network, and the whole planet is being monitored by these. Then they have their major allies, their partners in NATO. So other countries like France, Germany, and so forth are part of that network. And then there are the agreements that they reach with other countries on a bilateral basis, wherever they are in the world. So like for the US and the Philippines, or the US and Taiwan and so forth, where they reach agreements. And all of this is basically to get a huge surveillance network out there to find out what is happening on the front, on the extraterrestrial front. So for example, if there's a crash, if an extraterrestrial vehicle crashes somewhere, what they do is that they send a team, the US will send a team of specialists to that country, and they will interact with the intelligence service of that country to go to that location where the crash was, and they kind of cordon it off, and they basically warn off anyone who saw anything to swear them off to secrecy, and they kind of bring everything back to the United States. And the country that was involved with that kind of gets paid off. Typically it's like the intelligence community, they get perks, they get training in the United States, or they get their bank account, they get Swiss bank accounts or things like that. So they have carrots and they have sticks against anyone that doesn't cooperate. So it's a very sophisticated system that they have. It's been going on for a long time, and the Soviet Union and China have their own equivalents. The Soviet Union used to be much more formidable, and now, of course, the Russian Federation is kind of all that's left with a few satellites. But still, they have a vast territory, and so they have their own kind of way of dealing with the extraterrestrial visitors. So that's kind of like, just in a nutshell, how galactic diplomacy has unfolded at an official level on our planet, and more recently. We haven't really seen any major changes in that, other than just more information getting out, more whistleblowers releasing information that they know. So there's kind of more of an awareness of what has happened. So the public is kind of being primed, I think, for an eventual disclosure. But that doesn't mean it's going to be official. It'll probably be something like a public disclosure, like what we're doing now.
Laura Eisenhower, that's his granddaughter, right?
Great-granddaughter.
Great-granddaughter.
That's right, Laura Eisenhower.
She was invited to go either to the moon or to Mars.
Yeah, exactly.
Which one was it, the moon or Mars?
Mars, yeah. Laura Eisenhower, the great-granddaughter of the President Eisenhower, she was actually approached by a covert team of people that were associated with this colony on Mars. And she was asked if she wanted to join them on Mars because they saw her as someone with very valuable genetics. So that they really wanted her to get up there. And it kind of gets a little esoteric. I mean, it's funny, but people in the secret government are actually very esoteric. They understand the significance of things such as kind of spiritual ascension, higher consciousness, the chakra system.
She's at. She's into the Ascension.
Exactly.
And
So
she's got her own website. She's been on many talk shows,
yes.
coast to coast.
Right. So they saw her as someone that would actually be very valuable for kind of augmenting the genetic pool on Mars. Because on Mars, as far as we know, there are a number of secret colonies. I've actually just done a number of interviews with a whistleblower who says that there's 5 main human colonies on Mars. And so...
Hybrids or actual?
Human colonies. People from Earth that have been transplanted to Mars. I mean, there are also indigenous Martians, but the humans that are there are kind of essentially there to establish settlements, try and basically increase the human population on Mars, and interact with the indigenous Martians there. And as it was explained to me, on Mars it's very territorial, but you don't.
Kind of like here.
Very territorial, but you don't like invade another person's territory. It's like you look after your space, and if someone comes into your space, then you can kind of like use overwhelming force against them. But you don't go out to wipe out the other side.
Okay. This explains to me why the council said that the last of the full-blood extraterrestrials that were here for a long time have been taken to Mars. And I was wondering to myself, how were they taken to Mars when there's human colonies there? But you're saying that there is that there are, quote, Martians there. But I received information from the council some time ago that these Martians are the remnants of the Anunnaki who were here. And they had a colony on Mars, and when the Anunnaki left, these people on Mars got left there. So they are the descendants of the Anunnaki, and the extraterrestrials that were taken off of our planet were exiled back onto Mars with their own people. So that's how that has played out.
Sitchin's books, Sumerians talk about.
Right, about the Anunnaki. That's,
being on
that's,
Mars,
yeah,
the ones
right.
that, the workers, and I think they were,
Yeah.
I forgot what they were called.
Gigi?
The EGG, thank you, dear.
Right.
I love talking to you.
Deborah?
Oh, on Coast to Coast, last week Richard Hoagland came on with studies of the Chinese rabbit vehicle that's on the moon, taking pictures of the dark side, and they've been leaking. Richard Hoagland says that they've been leaking pictures of weird stuff on the moon, and Richard, it took him 4 months to take it all together and then present it on the crossing of the stars last week. And so when you guys say that they're going to be knocking down the door, knocking at the door, and kicking the door down, it seems to be me that the Chinese have opened the door a little bit, and Richard Hoagland put his foot in. Now, what Richard is saying is that, he needs to go to Russia and tell everyone, there's already, UFO stuff, the gig is up, you got UFOs, the planet needs to get together, and go to Mars, or go to the moon and get this the stuff and back engineer it. But then last night, Sarita was on, and he's already got the technology, but he can't find the $10 million from movie stars or the Saudis. Actually, the Saudis were going to invest in him, but the U.S. government told them not to invest. Now, if you even listen to Sarita and the black box that he has, that he's been trying to hawk and get production of for years, and he's been to all the other planets. And so it just shows that the Richard Hoagland is not happening, because he should know that this black box is here and he's funding. He even asked Sally Fields for $10 million, and she said no. Well, we know where the Hollywood people are.
Okay, all right. So yes, so there is that development where there may be a major space program, like the Chinese program, that puts out information, evidence that some people can say is clear evidence of extraterrestrial civilizations on the moon, and therefore this is kind of a form of disclosure. Again, it's not official disclosure. It's public disclosure because it's private citizens basically interpreting data that's been put out, by a government space agency, showing that there is actual remnants of extraterrestrial civilization on the moon.
So do you know which countries are into disclosure? That I know England was starting there and then they backed off,
Russia.
right?
Mexico is.
Mexico,
Isn't Russia too?
Russia.
Yeah, Russia is the country that actually has been most out there in terms of putting out information about extraterrestrials. Starting from the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, where they
Right,
released a lot of
yeah.
information. The KGB files were leaked out under President Yeltsin, the first Russian president. They actually had private UFO researchers interview senior military officers, a lieutenant general, and talk about extraterrestrials and UFOs, and they kind of shared the information. And since that time, there have been a number of Russian politicians, including the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, Medvedev, who's actually talked about extraterrestrials. So the Russians have been actually really out there.
Yeah.
But other countries, Mexico and Brazil, have actually had their Air Force, official Air Force officers interact with private UFO researchers to pass over information to them to research. But
I've been seeing UFO stories on Yahoo.
Well, there's a lot of good news, truthful news. I'm not saying it's good. On RT News, you guys.
What's that news?
Russian TV news. It's on channel 280. If you have Dish, you can get 280. But
Anyways, a comment just sounding like Anunnaki. So these were relatives of the Anunnaki that were quarantined to Mars, you were saying?
GT.
Is that was the quarantine that you were speaking of? Or?
They're
They were workers, right?
the ones that are there now.
No, the EGG. He was talking about
There were some that were quarantined there, supposedly.
Well, they weren't quarantined there. They were left when the Anunnaki just kind of packed up and left the area and left some of their workers
Yeah.
on Mars, but there was some here that stayed as well.
That's the one I thought you just said they sent back from here.
They did, yes.
Okay,
The ones that were here, that stayed here
Yes,
voluntarily, because they kind of usurped the rule of the planet, and they were here for a long time, behind the scenes of upfront governments and leaderships of countries working. And they have been removed from the planet and taken, there's not that many of them left, and they were taken to Mars where they're descendants.
These are negative type.
Yes, they're the ones that, have been here just, wreaking havoc with humanity. So in other words, the bad guys have already been here and done their thing, and they're moving more and more out of the picture. And what's coming in is the benevolent extraterrestrials and bringing forth, all of their helpful, beneficial ways.
Can you identify those? Do they go by a name?
Well, they are as far as names go, you, they're from various galaxies. And so you've got some from Andromeda, some from Pleiades, some from Sirius, some, you know, it's just the more advanced ones that are actually coming here. And those are the ones that are going to be interacting with us. And there's another group also, which is the ascended beings who no longer live in this particular dimension. They're beyond this dimension. They are coming back too. And that's what they explain in the book, their reason for coming.
I'm just wondering, can we relate what's coming, the good ones that are coming, to the groups in the past that have been here that have been described as good, like the Ashtar Command, or are they related to that?
Well, there's various. The groups that are coming are of various levels of understanding,
Okay.
and so you have various levels of technology,
Yeah.
and various levels of what their interests are,
Yeah.
you know, and what their thing in life is. Some are very scientific,
Yeah.
others are explorers, and so what I'm gathering from what the council is saying is that these particular different kinds of extraterrestrials will vibrationally attract to them certain humans who humans are some are very scientific, that's what they like doing, some are like to explore, others are very earthy, and then the ascended beings. And so you have this various levels and various types of extraterrestrials that will be here. And so there will be someone for everybody.
I got you. Okay.
So there'll be the music guys for you.
There,
Yeah.
that's
There'll be
right.
music guys
Yes,
for you.
the musicians.
Which brings up, I guess, kind of my question is, since we've already, I believe, had some of these extraterrestrial ascended beings, say with music, working with earthlings, I guess I'm wondering, are they of the, how can I say it? A group of people comes to Pahoa, and you've been working with them, and then someone says, okay, we got some other people coming. So you're like, okay, well, are they related to the people who've already been here? Are they from a different country?
There's gonna be people from all different galaxies,
Yeah.
all over
Yeah,
thousands
right.
and thousands.
Yeah.
So it sounds like
I
maybe
say
it's...
people, but, you know, extraterrestrials.
Yeah.
They could be related, and they may,
Okay.
and there will be others that are
It's
not.
a greater influx.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Well,
Right.
actually, the next meeting, I'll talk about the different positive
Oh,
extraterrestrial groups that have been coming, and I'll
Oh,
go through them, and
Okay.
I'll go through
Yeah.
quite a number of them in
Yeah.
terms, and they have different qualities. You know, some have different specialties. Some are kind of more artistic, more wisdom oriented, whereas others are more kind of like warriors, you know, ready to fight against the injustice. And
Yeah,
so they're different categories.
Okay.
you know, like Tolak too, you know, I saw you brought him up in your book, and I've been checking him out ever since he came on the scene. And he does a good job of just telling what the different ones look like. And they're just supposed to come and like be in, maybe they'll go to the park or something, but they're not gonna come right out yet and say, okay, we're here. But they're already starting to do that now.
Ultimately, I mean, I think what will happen is once you get to be immersed in this information, you'll actually be able to feel the vibration of these
Right.
groups, of these different
Yeah.
groups. Like the Arcturian vibration is very different to the Andromedan vibration, which is very different to the Pleiadian vibration, and so on. And you'll be able to feel that. The more you can tune in, you'll feel the difference.
Right.
It's all the
Yeah,
vibe thing.
you know,
Yeah.
he describes a lot of them, if that's what you're wondering.
Say again?
He describes them, what they look like, their hair, their skin.
Yeah.
His counsel, whoever's talking to him, has been telling him that,
Okay.
letting him know, and plus he's seen him actually in his house.
Mike?
Well, just one or a couple things. On the Martians especially, these are subterranean civilizations for the most part, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I was getting that really strongly. And also you mentioned Eisenhower, and I'm familiar with a lot of that information. Is this something each presidency has is dealing with, or is it only certain ones at times of crisis that are being brought in, or do all of them know what's going on?
Basically, President Eisenhower was the last president that actually was directly involved in making decisions on these issues. After him, Kennedy was actually cut out of the loop, and that was one of the things that actually got him to try and find out what was going on, and ultimately led to the assassination. And every president after that has more or less been a rubber stamp for decisions being made by the executive committees that run the whole kind of US part of this secret underground official program to understand and reverse engineer extraterrestrial technologies.
Are any of them working with the Japanese at present to try and fix Fukushima?
Well, Japan still is largely an American protectorate, even though it's an independent nation. I mean, it's still basically key US officials have the biggest say in the policy of Japan. And so when it comes to extraterrestrial visitors, it's more or less, you know, what the US will allow. But there is technologies that exist that would allow Japan to kind of like go off nuclear energy really quickly, but the Japanese aren't allowed to introduce those technologies.
Yeah, and they're very secretive about letting any news out on Fukushima.
Yeah, it's face. I don't want to lose face.
You know, how Laura Eisenhower, she's, in general, she was saying the ones that met with Eisenhower first was the Canadians that said get rid of the nuclear weapons. She specifically said them. And I mean, that's something like, like right now, I'm trying to see who the ascended beings are, whether were they ascended at the time themselves. I mean, that sounds like something an ascended being would say, get rid of your nuclear weapons. You know, I mean, that's from here saying it. And then I know Canadians are part of the IDOC, and I guess there's Andromedans in everyone's part of that. That's ascended, but is that something that's new, that they're ascended now, and were they ascended them when they offered that, or is that a group that's heavy, we're basically behind us too, or the Canadians, are they a big group that's behind us?
They would be the Ascended Masters. The Ascended Masters being the extraterrestrials who have not yet ascended on beyond the lower triad. So they are evolved to the highest level of understanding within the lower triad. So
That was then though, but not now. Now, are they a group now that's ascended beings?
they could
Into the
be
upper tier?
some of them, yeah. Up until now, the ascension process has been one person at a time. As you reach that level, on a personal level.
I mean, just remember reading like your books, where your body is dealt with creating, and
Yeah,
so
right.
so there's definitely different races
Oh, yeah.
in the IDLCs, not
Oh, yeah,
just
right.
all one race.
No,
I think.
Yeah, that's correct. So, what time do
I
we
think we
have?
could. Yeah, I think we need to wrap
Move
it up.
on?
Yep.
Okay, we're going to move on to our next